The house sat at the edge of town, looming like a scar against the backdrop of the suburban hills. Its windows were caked in grime, the curtains torn and dangling like strips of old fabric clinging to life. From the outside it looked abandoned, yet the stench that carried through the air told a different story. Neighbors often described it as a sour mixture of rotting meat and chemicals, strong enough to make stomachs turn even from the sidewalk. Children whispered that demons lived inside, daring one another to approach but never crossing the rusted fence that encircled the yard. Adults, too, kept their distance, muttering about the man who lived there and warning each other to avoid eye contact should they pass him on the street. That man was Pazuzu Algarad, though he had once been born with an ordinary name. He had buried that identity long ago, trading it for something darker, something he believed connected him to powers beyond human comprehension. His appearance alone fed the stories. Tattoos climbed across his skin, winding up his arms, onto his chest, and spilling onto his face in chaotic symbols and letters. His teeth were sharp and discolored, giving him the grotesque smile of a predator. He carried himself with a strange mix of arrogance and unpredictability, at times wandering barefoot in the neighborhood, muttering to himself in broken sentences that no one could understand. To the outside world, he was a living warning sign, a man who had rejected every rule of society and wrapped himself in the identity of the grotesque. But while the neighbors knew of him, none truly understood the depth of what was happening inside those walls. The house was not simply a home, but a kingdom of filth and control. Garbage piled knee-high in the corners, animal remains scattered across the floors, and graffiti covered every surface. People drifted in and out, drawn by drugs, chaos, or simply the need to belong to someone who seemed larger than life. Pazuzu fed on that attention, styling himself as a dark figurehead for the lost and desperate. He thrived on shock, inviting those who dared to witness the things he claimed to do in service of forces unseen. In that world, he was not a recluse but a ruler, and the house itself became an extension of his twisted personality. What made his presence even more unsettling was the relationship he had with his mother, Cynthia. She was the one constant in his fractured life, the person who had known him before the tattoos, before the filth, before he abandoned his birth name. To many, she appeared as a quiet, almost invisible figure in his shadow. She lived her life on the margins, excusing his behaviors and attempting to explain away the horror stories neighbors passed around. She believed, or perhaps convinced herself, that beneath the layers of cruelty and madness, her son was still present, the boy she had raised through hardship and loneliness. That belief tied her to him in ways that others could not comprehend, and it blinded her to the storm that was building inside the walls of his home. For Pazuzu, her presence was both a reminder of the past he despised and a connection he could not completely sever. He accepted her loyalty, but resented her at the same time. She represented structure, morality, and the life he had spent years trying to bury. Each time she visited, each time she attempted to show care, it chipped away at the persona he had created. To his followers, he was untouchable, a figure of darkness with no weaknesses. But to his mother, he was still human, still vulnerable, and that was something he could not forgive. The house itself became the stage where these contradictions played out. On the outside, he frightened strangers with his appearance and his reputation. On the inside, he built an environment of lawlessness where every boundary was meant to be broken. Yet hidden beneath the chaos was an undercurrent of something more dangerous: his growing contempt for the only person who still dared to see him as a son. The community feared Pazuzu for what he might do to others, but what no one suspected was that his darkest act of violence would not be directed at outsiders or strangers who entered his world. Instead, it would strike at the very heart of family, an act of betrayal that would sever the last tie binding him to his humanity. The whispers surrounding his house had always carried tones of dread, but as the months passed, they grew sharper. Some spoke of rituals, others of missing animals, and still others of sounds at night that no one could quite explain. It was easy for the outside world to dismiss these as rumors, the kinds of stories that grow out of fear and imagination. But in this case, the truth was far worse than anyone allowed themselves to believe. Behind the filth and the stench, beyond the locked door and the shadows, a plan was forming in Pazuzu's mind. It was not a sudden impulse but a steady, deliberate decision to remove the last piece of his old life. What began as rebellion and shock would soon spiral into something no one could have predicted: the destruction of his own blood, carried out in the very house that had long been the symbol of his darkness. Before the world came to know the name Pazuzu Algarad, there was John Lawson, a boy who grew up surrounded by chaos and instability. From his earliest years, the signs of his troubled nature were already apparent. Teachers noticed the anger that simmered beneath his surface, erupting in outbursts that left classmates frightened and adults at a loss for how to handle him. He was restless, disruptive, and often drawn to disturbing ideas that set him apart from children his age. His childhood home offered little relief. His father was absent, leaving his mother, Cynthia, to shoulder the burden of raising him alone. She tried to provide him with stability, but in truth she was overwhelmed and unprepared to deal with the depths of her son's darkness. What she saw as unusual behavior others began to recognize as something far more dangerous, yet she refused to give up on him. As John grew older, his fascination with the darker sides of life deepened. While other children played sports or joined clubs, he was drawn to stories of death, violence, and occult imagery. He sought out horror films and books about the supernatural, gravitating toward anything that gave him the thrill of fear and the sense of power that came from defying the ordinary. His bedroom walls reflected his interests, covered in unsettling drawings and symbols that unsettled Cynthia, but which she brushed aside as expressions of teenage rebellion. She told herself that it was a phase, something he would outgrow, but the truth was that it was only the beginning of a transformation that would one day consume him completely. The transition from John Lawson to Pazuzu was not sudden but gradual, marked by a series of deliberate choices meant to shed his old identity. He despised the name he was given at birth, considering it a tether to a life he wanted to erase. By renaming himself after a Mesopotamian demon, he declared his allegiance to something darker than family or society could comprehend. The name Pazuzu became a shield, a mask behind which he could build his twisted persona. Tattoos began to cover his skin, each one another layer separating him from the boy he once was. They crept across his arms, chest, and face until his own reflection bore little resemblance to his former self. He was not simply altering his appearance, he was erasing it, piece by piece, until nothing recognizable remained. For Cynthia, this transformation was painful to witness. She watched her son sink further into isolation, surrounding himself with people who encouraged his self-destructive path. His house became a reflection of his inner decay, a place where filth and chaos ruled. Piles of garbage, broken furniture, and strange markings on the walls gave it the feel of a tomb rather than a home. The smell alone drove away visitors, but Cynthia still returned. She told herself that by staying close she could prevent him from falling off the edge completely. Yet, in her quiet heart, she felt the distance growing wider each time she saw him. He no longer spoke of normal things, no longer showed any trace of the child she had raised. Despite her fear, she continued to cling to the belief that he could be saved. Mothers often hold hope long after others have abandoned it, and Cynthia was no exception. She saw through the tattoos and the filth, still searching for the boy she once cradled in her arms. But her loyalty was also her weakness. What she viewed as compassion, Pazuzu saw as intrusion. Each visit reminded him of the life he had rejected, and each attempt she made to reach him was interpreted as defiance against the identity he had created. He did not see her as a mother trying to help. He saw her as a threat to the control he worked so hard to maintain. The community around them whispered about his behavior, spreading stories of his late night wanderings and unsettling habits. People avoided him on the street, crossing to the other side rather than risk an encounter. To them, he was a symbol of everything dangerous and unpredictable, a man who had chosen darkness over decency. For Cynthia, however, he was still her son, even as he slipped further away from her. The two worlds clashed within her every time she visited, torn between the reality of who he had become and the memory of who he once was. That tension built quietly over the years, setting the stage for a tragedy she could not imagine. By the time Pazuzu fully embraced his new identity, he was no longer tethered to the ordinary structures of family or society. He was a man who believed himself to be more than human, devoted to chaos and control. Cynthia's role in his life became increasingly fragile, her presence tolerated but resented. To outsiders, it seemed inevitable that something would break, though no one could have predicted how far he was willing to go. What began as a child's rebellion had grown into a man's descent into darkness, and the mother who never stopped loving him would soon discover that her devotion placed her in the most dangerous position of all. By the late 2000s, the decaying house on Nob Hill Drive had become more than just a place to live. It was the center of a world where chaos reigned and normal rules no longer applied. Neighbors could see the transformation taking place, as the yard filled with debris, broken furniture, and strange objects scattered with no purpose other than to add to the air of decay. The smell became so strong that even with the windows shut tight, residents of nearby homes complained that it seeped into their lives. Yet, despite the filth and the warnings whispered from one family to another, people still came to that house. They came because it was a place without order, where the only authority was Pazuzu himself. He had turned his home into a sanctuary for the broken, the addicted, and the desperate. Inside, the conditions were worse than anyone could have imagined. Garbage carpeted the floors, animal remains were left to rot, and walls were covered in graffiti that mixed occult symbols with crude words. Broken bottles and needles glistened under dim light, while stains marked the carpets and furniture with reminders of countless nights of indulgence. The air was heavy and suffocating, thick with the mixture of decay and smoke. Those who entered were often already at rock bottom, people who had no place else to go, and in Pazuzu they found someone who offered them both freedom and control. He welcomed them into his domain, but his kindness was not born from compassion. It was a method of control, a way of surrounding himself with people who would not question him, who would follow his rules no matter how twisted they became. It was here that Pazuzu's reputation grew, not just as a strange figure on the streets, but as a man who commanded fear and fascination. Rumors spread of rituals carried out in the house, of nights when screams were heard but never investigated, of bodies buried in shallow graves on the property. Some said he drank blood, others claimed he sacrificed animals or worse. The authorities received reports, but by the time they investigated, little evidence was ever found to confirm the stories. The house had become a black hole of suspicion and dread, a place where the line between rumor and truth blurred so completely that no one outside could distinguish one from the other. Cynthia still visited, though each time she stepped through the door, she was met with a reality that was almost too much to bear. She saw her son sitting in the middle of the decay, surrounded by people who seemed less like guests and more like prisoners of his influence. He ruled over them with a mix of charisma and menace, ensuring they feared him enough to stay loyal. To her, it was heartbreaking to see the boy she raised transform into something unrecognizable, but her hope refused to fade. She tried to convince herself that beneath the filth and cruelty, there was still a part of him that could be saved. She cleaned when she could, spoke words of encouragement, and begged him to change, but each attempt was dismissed or mocked. Her visits began to draw his resentment. Where others obeyed him, she challenged him by reminding him of the person he once was. To his followers, he was a figure of fear and darkness, but to her, he was still her son, and that threatened the illusion he had worked so hard to create. Every time she tried to intervene, he felt exposed. It was as if she was peeling away the mask he had built and showing the cracks beneath. To a man who thrived on control, this was intolerable. Slowly her presence shifted from tolerated to despised. She became in his mind a weakness, a reminder of a life he had rejected. The tension between them grew thicker with each encounter. Cynthia's love, once his shield, had become the very thing he wanted to destroy. She believed she could still help him, but her faith blinded her to the danger she was in. The house, filled with strangers who obeyed his every command, was no longer just a space of chaos, but a trap closing in around her. Those who gathered there saw her, not as a mother, but as an outsider threatening their leader. Her vulnerability stood out in a place where everyone else knew better than to challenge him. The tipping point was reached one night when she urged him once again to change, to seek a different life. Her words, spoken with love and desperation, were received as betrayal. For Pazuzu, the kingdom he had built could not survive her interference. To maintain the identity he had created, to protect the fear and respect that kept his world intact, he needed to silence the one person who still saw through him. The decision formed quietly, as much a product of his resentment as of his need for absolute control. No one on the outside could have imagined what was coming. To neighbors, she was simply the mother of the strange man who lived in the worst house on the street. To her, he was still her child, no matter how far gone he seemed. But within the decaying walls, a plan was taking shape, one that would turn whispers of horror into a chilling reality. Her love for him, the bond that had survived through every stage of his descent, would soon become the very reason she would never leave that house alive. The night of Cynthia's death unfolded without warning to the outside world, a night swallowed in silence while the rest of the town slept. Inside the house on Nob Hill Drive, however, the atmosphere was heavier than usual, as though every object within those rotting walls had been waiting for something inevitable to happen. The filth was no different than it had been for months. Garbage piled high, walls stained, floors layered with grime. But there was an energy in the air, a kind of charged anticipation that set this night apart from the rest. Cynthia had come once again, her heart still bound by the hope that she could reach her son, still believing that somewhere beneath the tattoos, the madness, and the decay, there was a fragment of John Lawson left to save. Her presence was not welcomed as she might have hoped. To the others gathered there, she was not family, but an intruder, a woman whose words threatened the fragile kingdom Pazuzu had built. They sat silently, eyes darting between mother and son, careful not to interfere but aware that the tension between them was thick enough to choke the air. Cynthia urged him to see the destruction around him, to imagine a different life, one free from the darkness that consumed him. Her voice was steady but filled with the quiet desperation of someone who had repeated the same plea countless times. Yet on this night, those words pierced deeper, striking at the core of the identity Pazuzu had crafted for himself. For years, he had shaped his existence into a grotesque performance of rebellion, presenting himself as a creature of chaos, untouchable and feared. His house was his stage, his followers his audience, and his appearance his mask. But in his mother's eyes, he was not the dark figure he projected to the world, he was still her son. That vision threatened everything he stood for. To her, it was love. To him, it was weakness. Each word she spoke felt like an attempt to strip him of his authority, to unravel the persona he had carefully built. And in front of those who looked to him for dominance, it was intolerable. The decision to silence her was not sudden. It had lingered in his mind long before that night, a shadowy possibility that grew stronger with each visit she made. She had become the last chain tying him to the humanity he sought to reject. Ending her life was not just an act of violence, but a declaration, proof that he had severed the final tie to his past. The act itself was chillingly methodical, carried out not in rage but in cold calculation. There was no spectacle, no outburst, just a grim efficiency that suggested he had already rehearsed it in his mind countless times before. The house became her tomb, almost immediately. Her body was hidden in the squalor, blending into the chaos as though the house itself had swallowed her. For days, her absence went unnoticed by the outside world. Neighbors assumed she was quiet, perhaps visiting relatives or simply retreating into her private life. No one thought to question why she was no longer seen stepping cautiously through her son's door. Within the decaying walls, however, her absence was a presence of its own, a silence that echoed louder than any sound. Those who lived under Pazuzu's rule understood what had happened but spoke of it only in whispers, terrified of what might happen to them if they voiced the truth. For Pazuzu, her death was a final transformation. He no longer carried the burden of her watchful eyes, no longer felt the weight of her hope pressing against his darkness. In his mind, he had ascended fully into the figure he had always wanted to be, unchallenged and unbound. The act of killing his own mother, to most an unthinkable betrayal, became to him a symbol of liberation. He paraded through his world with a renewed sense of control, his followers seeing him not as a man, but as something beyond, someone capable of severing even the most sacred bond. Yet beneath the layers of bravado and decay, the truth of his crime lingered. It clung to the walls, seeped into the air, and hung in the silence that followed Cynthia's disappearance. The house bore the weight of it, as if every corner carried a secret too heavy to contain. It was not long before suspicions began to stir beyond the whispers of those inside. Neighbors who once dismissed the stories as rumors began to take notice of her absence. Authorities who had heard the tales of that house for years found new reasons to look closer. The secret buried in the filth was beginning to push its way to the surface, demanding to be uncovered. In the end, Cynthia's death was not only the ultimate betrayal of a mother's love, but the moment that shattered the fragile illusion Pazuzu had maintained. What he believed to be liberation was, in truth, the act that sealed his fate. The house could no longer contain its secrets, and the world outside was ready to confront the horrors it had long ignored. What unfolded that night was not just the murder of a mother, but the collapse of the last barrier between a disturbed man and the justice that had been chasing him all along. When the truth about Cynthia's fate finally surfaced, it sent shockwaves far beyond the neighborhood that had whispered about the strange man at the edge of town. For years, people had lived with uneasy suspicions, trading rumors of what might be happening inside the decaying house. But the confirmation that Pazuzu had not only embraced darkness, but turned it against his own mother, was a revelation that seemed too horrific to believe. The story spread quickly, gripping the community, and drawing the attention of media outlets eager to expose the man behind the name. The image of a son betraying the one person who had stood by him became the defining symbol of his downfall, a crime that seemed to embody evil in its purest form. Investigators who entered the house were immediately struck by the overwhelming stench, and the squalor that covered every inch of the property. The filth was not a matter of neglect, but a deliberate rejection of order, a physical manifestation of the chaos Pazuzu worshipped. Hidden within that filth, however, was the evidence that confirmed the worst suspicions. Cynthia's life had ended in the very place she had hoped to save her son from, and the house itself had become her grave. For the officers tasked with piecing together the details, it was a scene that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The discovery was not just evidence of a crime, but a glimpse into the mind of a man who had long abandoned any trace of humanity. As the investigation unfolded, the community grappled with the reality of what had been living in their midst. Parents who once warned their children not to go near the house now struggled to explain how the warnings had been justified all along. Neighbors who dismissed the stories as exaggerations were forced to admit that the truth was even darker than the rumors. The quiet suburban street that had once been defined by ordinary lives was now infamous, marked by the legacy of a crime that would haunt it for years to come. Reporters flocked to the area, their cameras capturing the grim facade of the house, while interviews with former acquaintances painted a picture of a man who had always seemed destined for destruction. In court, the image of Pazuzu as a self-proclaimed embodiment of evil clashed with the reality of his crime. Prosecutors described him as manipulative and cruel, someone who thrived on control and used fear to keep others silent. Witnesses spoke of the house as a prison of chaos, recounting nights filled with strange rituals and whispered threats. Yet through it all, the most devastating testimony came from the story of his mother. Cynthia had been the one person who never abandoned him, the last thread connecting him to any semblance of family or love. To hear that she had become his victim was enough to silence even the most hardened observers in the courtroom. For many, the case was more than just another crime. It became a reflection of how unchecked darkness can grow when ignored. The community had long been uneasy about the man on Nob Hill Drive, but few had acted on their suspicions, dismissing the warning signs as eccentricity or empty rumor. In hindsight, every strange sound, every foul odor, every unsettling encounter took on new meaning. People realized that what they had brushed aside had been evidence of something far more dangerous. Cynthia's death became the symbol of that negligence, a reminder of what can happen when fear keeps people silent. Pazuzu himself seemed almost proud of the legacy he was leaving behind. To him, the crime was not an act of shame but of power, proof that he had fully embraced the darkness he had spent years cultivating. In the eyes of the world, however, he was no more than a man consumed by his own delusions, a figure whose attempts to embody evil had led only to tragedy. His name became infamous, tied forever to the betrayal of the bond between mother and child. The house, once his kingdom of filth, was condemned and eventually torn down, though even in its absence the memory of what happened there lingered. In the end, the story of Pazuzu Algarad was not just about a son who killed his mother. It was about the slow unraveling of a life shaped by pain, rebellion, and a desperate desire for control. It was about a community that watched from a distance, unwilling or unable to confront the growing horror until it was too late. And most of all, it was about a mother whose love endured until the very moment it was extinguished by the child she had never stopped believing in. Her death was the final act in a story that had been building for years, a story of decay and betrayal that left behind a warning written in blood and silence. What began as whispers on a quiet street ended as a chilling testament to how far darkness can reach when it grows unchecked, consuming even the bonds that most people believe can never be broken.